This is the incredible story that gave birth to the United States of America. So, how exactly did a disagreement over taxes lead to the creation of a brand new nation? Well, to figure out how we get from throwing snowballs in the street to full-blown open warfare against the most powerful empire on Earth, we kind of have to skip past Christopher Columbus and the Vikings. Instead, we need to zero in on the real inciting incident here: miscommunication and, of course, money. That brings us to Section 1, the cost of empire. Picture this. After winning a brutal 7-year global conflict against the French, Great Britain is standing victorious. The catch, they were left completely broke. We are talking about a staggering £60 million in debt. At the time, that is an absolute economy-crushing amount of money. So naturally, they looked over at the American colonies to, well, pay them back. The British argued, hey, we just spent a massive fortune protecting you guys from the French, so you should probably foot part of the bill. But, as you might guess, the colonists didn't exactly see it that way. Because the British felt they'd emptied their wallets keeping the colonists safe, they felt entirely justified rolling out some highly controversial new taxes. It kicks off in 1764 with the Sugar Act, literally forcing colonists to buy their sugar and molasses exclusively from Britain. Then in 1765 comes the incredibly unpopular Stamp Act, hitting basically every single piece of paper. When the colonists actually managed to successfully protest that one, Britain doubled down hard in 1766 with the Declaratory Act. This was essentially them saying, look, we can do whatever we want, we are in charge here. And they followed that right up with an absolute avalanche of new import duties, taxing everyday stuff like glass, lead, paper, tea, and oil. And this quote right here just brilliantly captures the sheer everyday frustration down on the ground. Imagine you're a colonist, just trying to go about your life. You want a deed for a new shack, you want to read a pamphlet, or maybe you just want a deck of cards to gamble your pain away. But at every single turn, it's stamp, 2 pence please. The colonists were absolutely furious. They were paying these arbitrary taxes while having zero representation in the parliament that was actually making the rules. They were used to relative freedom, and suddenly they're being squeezed dry. All right, moving on to Section 2, the boiling point. It is truly fascinating to watch this rapid, chaotic escalation, mostly centering right around Boston. Believe it or not, it started with a snowball fight. Yep, locals were literally throwing snowballs at a British guard on March 5th. Well, those snowballs quickly turned to rocks. The outnumbered British soldiers panicked, shots rang out, and 5 civilians lay dead in what we now know as the Boston Massacre. From there, things just spiraled completely out of control. Locals burned a British schooner down in Rhode Island, they torched the Massachusetts governor's house, and then on December 16, 1773, the Sons of Liberty took direct aim at the remaining tea tax. They dumped 10,000 pounds of tea straight into Boston Harbor. And man, Britain's response was swift and furious. They dissolved the Massachusetts General Assembly and put Boston under total military occupation. Worried they were going to be the very next target of British vengeance, 56 delegates from 12 colonies gathered in Philadelphia for the First Continental Congress. And this was basically a brain trust of America's finest thinkers. You had extraordinary lawyers like John Adams and John Jay, experienced military minds like George Washington, savvy businessmen like Samuel Adams, and fiery orators like Patrick Henry, all coming together to figure out a game plan. Now, their initial solution was actually surprisingly tame. They kind of just politely asked the British to stop. Unsurprisingly, the king essentially said, no way. So when diplomacy totally failed, Congress made a monumental pivot. The message went out: tell the local militias to start arming and be ready at a minute's notice. Literally overnight, everyday civilian Minutemen across the colonies began prepping for the unthinkable. Which brings us right to Section 3. The war begins. The narrative takes a heavy shift here, because having colonies in political rebellion is one thing, but once they actively arm themselves, it is officially war. And the crucial takeaway is the staggering mismatch of power when the fighting actually broke out. British General Thomas Gage sent 700 troops into the countryside to destroy rebel supplies in Concord. But after the famous shot heard round the world at Lexington, the British advanced, only to find more and more patriot rebels swarming in. A shockwave rippled through history right here. The most professional, well-equipped army in the world was decisively forced to turn tail and flee all the way back to Boston, constantly harassed by local, poorly trained militiamen every step of the way. Meanwhile, up in New York, we get this almost hilarious but incredibly critical tactical victory. 2 American leaders, Benedict Arnold and Ethan Allen, independently decided to raid the British stronghold of Fort Ticonderoga for its weapons. When they literally bumped into each other on the way there, they bickered endlessly over who was actually in charge of the mission. But despite this giant clash of egos, they raided the fort at night, caught the redcoats completely asleep, and took the whole place, and crucially all of its munitions, with almost zero resistance. Back in Philly, Congress knew a massive, crushing British retaliation was inevitably coming. They needed a proper, unified Continental Army, and they needed a leader. So they appointed George Washington as commander-in-chief. And let's be totally honest here, it wasn't a huge surprise. Washington had been aggressively dropping hints by wearing his military uniform to Congress every single day for 10 straight months. I mean, talk about dressing for the job you want. Washington headed straight for Boston, where the colonists quickly proved to the British that this was not just some minor skirmish. They were ready for a real war. Just look at the casualty numbers from the Battle of Bunker Hill. They tell a staggering story. The British kept advancing on the fortified American positions, and twice they were completely pushed back. Now, the Americans eventually had to retreat simply because they ran out of ammo, but not before inflicting nearly 1,000 devastating casualties on the British, while only suffering about 400 themselves. That is a massive wake-up call. Washington then managed to break the long, freezing, absolutely miserable siege of Boston by pulling off a logistical miracle. Remember Fort Ticonderoga? Well, Washington's men used oxen to drag 120,000 pounds of that captured artillery 300 miles across the harsh, freezing winter landscape. They secretly set up these massive guns overnight on Dorchester Heights, directly overlooking the city. So when the British woke up and saw a wall of cannons pointing right down at them, checkmate, 120 British ships were forced to flee, handing Washington his first major victory. And that sets us up for Section 4, Independence and Reality. At this point, thanks to the wild popularity of Thomas Paine's pamphlet Common Sense, the once radical idea of total independence was spreading across the colonies like wildfire. Congress literally could not ignore it anymore. Thomas Jefferson was tapped to draft the official declaration, famously writing that all men are created equal, which is obviously a heavy contradiction considering the historical reality that Jefferson himself owned over 100 slaves at the time. Still, on July 2nd, Congress voted unanimously in favor. The United States of America was officially born. And how did the Americans celebrate this historic act of treason? In a very practical way, actually. They tore down this massive lead statue of King George in New York City, and they melted the king down into 42,000 musket balls to use directly against his own troops. The point of no return had officially been crossed. But unfortunately, those celebrations were cut extremely short. King George, who had already refused an earlier American peace petition with a promise of violence, retaliated by bringing the hammer down. He deployed an unimaginably intimidating force of 130 warships and 25,000 professional soldiers straight to New York. Washington was drastically outmatched by the most powerful military in the world. All he could do was dig his men into defensive positions around Brooklyn Heights and wait for the inevitable. When the British finally attacked, Washington was just utterly outmaneuvered. The British used brilliant tactics here. They sent 15,000 troops right at the American front as a massive decoy, while their main force quietly flanked the Americans completely from behind. It was pure disaster. The Americans panicked, took heavy casualties, and retreated, getting hopelessly trapped between the British Army and the river. They were entirely at the mercy of the British Empire. But miraculously, instead of finishing them off right there, the British paused to dig in for a siege. And right at that moment, a thick, heavy fog rolled in, giving Washington's battered army just enough cover to escape across the river with zero visibility. And this leaves us with a truly astonishing cliffhanger. Washington's leadership is seriously in question. His broken army has to leave thousands of prisoners of war behind, to rot as traitors, and they're forced to frantically flee through New Jersey all the way to Pennsylvania, suffering defeat after defeat. Rarely in history has an army been so badly beaten, which leaves us with one burning question. How could this trapped, totally demoralized army of rebels possibly survive to continue the revolution, let alone actually win their freedom? It really makes you think about how fragile history is, doesn't it? What does it take to turn the tide from absolute crushing defeat? Keep that in mind, and we will see you in the next explainer.